Good morning, everybody. It is great to be with you guys again today. We're continuing our discussion of foundations, that is, core Christian principles. Last week, we're continuing I think it's lesson 5. We're continuing lesson 5 that we were on last week, so hopefully you still have the handout from last week. If we get to the next handout, I'll give it to you if we get there. Last week we were talking about the different ways in which the Bible tries to describe the church. And it uses a couple of illustrative ideas, illustrative concepts to convey both the structure of the church, the organization of the church, as well as kind of the purpose and the mission of the church. Do you remember what those 3 illustrative concepts were that we talked about last week? Okay, we did talk about body. What else? There were 2 more. If you need to cheat, you should have a cheat sheet in front of you. One of them was family, and then there was this one. Idea of fellowship. And we talked quite a bit about fellowship because most often when we hear the idea of fellowship, at least growing up, what I understood that to mean was potluck. Because the two just kind of seem to go together. It's the idea of interactions. Oftentimes there were games associated with it, talking, but it was the idea of engagement, and certainly that is included with fellowship, but it is not limited to fellowship. That's why I'm using this idea. This is the fellowship of the ring. And if you remember the movie, it is called the Fellowship of the Ring because all of these individuals were on a journey together, on a purpose together. A way you could also translate fellowship is the idea of a joint business venture, which means you would share in the risks, share in the rewards, share in the challenges, but there would also be an element of just sharing connection. So I don't want to say that fellowship is not sharing connection. By no means. It is. It's just more than just simply that. And we too are a fellowship in that we are on a joint business venture with Christ, if you will. We are on a joint mission together with one another to fulfill his purposes. And so the Bible uses all 3 ideas, all 3 illustrative concepts to convey the structure, the purpose, and the mission of the church. So I want to continue our discussion. You should be on page 29 of your book. And these are the blanks for page 29. The most important thing we want to remember anytime we're talking in terms of structure of the church is who is it that is our head, and that is Christ. That everything has to flow from him. It's important to remember that this is a monarchy as opposed to a democracy, which I can't help but wonder if, given our location within a democracy, if we sometimes struggle to understand the implications of a monarchy and the importance of recognizing that the church is a monarchy. I'm curious of your perspective. Why would it be important to emphasize, especially in this location, that the church is a monarchy with Christ as its head as opposed to a democracy? What do you think? And what is the difference between the two?
What you've got up there in comparison to just Christ being the head?
Okay. Democracy, well, you all live in a democracy. Have you noticed how we all believe that our voice matters? So much so that we are going to go to social media and my voice matters. My voice needs to be heard. My voice is important. My vote is important. Don't mishear me. I'm not saying that our voices as Christians don't matter at all. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that we believe that our voice matters so much that we should have a say in how everything is run that is around us, and that everyone should listen and care about the voice that we have in terms of how everything is run around us. And then if we don't like something, that we should have the power to be able to change it, that I should have the power to be able to change it. How is that different than a monarchy? What do you think? You had your hand up just a minute ago.
Person in charge.
Okay, a monarchy, mono, there's one person in charge. Okay, with the idea of absolute power. I told you I can read your lips. Yeah. So in my mind, sometimes when we hear the idea of that Christ is king, we know that, we believe that to be true, but our experience with the king is limited to what we see on British TV. Or how we watch the royal family in Britain at this point in time. That is our experience with the idea of a king or with monarchy. So at times I think it's hard for us to even wrap our minds around what we are saying when we say Christ is king. Because king has absolute power at all points in time, can do that which he wants, and you really don't get a say in it. It's up to him. Now, why that becomes important in terms of the church is, does it matter what I think? To an extent, yes, because we care about one another. We want to take one another's thought processes and beliefs and perspectives into account. But when it comes to how we are to live and how we are to interact, we are first and foremost only to be concerned with what Christ thinks, because ultimately his perspective and his thoughts are all that really matters, because it's a monarchy as opposed to a democracy. Any other thoughts? Yep.
It's hard not to, even though it's a have to. Consider that we're human beings, so we think that we're so important and what we think matters so much in regards to the church and stuff, and it does, like you said, to limited aspects. But Christ is God, and if that's it is the truth, and since that is the truth, we don't have rights to go outside of what he says.
Absolutely. And that's ultimately what we're going for, is the idea of we are to follow that which he lays forth, because he is the one in charge, not man. There are times when we're not going to like it. There are things, especially even within structure, that I may not like. I may not even understand why God chose to do it the way he chose to do it. That's okay. I don't have to understand. I don't have to like it. But because he is king, I am to follow what he has laid forth, even if I don't really understand it. Leads us to our next blank, the idea in terms of leaders, that we believe that the elders are the ones who lead and help direct the church. Now, when I say lead, what do you think about? What comes to mind whenever I say lead? What images, what thoughts does the word lead, what connotations does the word lead bring to mind? Yep. Okay.
No matter what, and I see it a little bit more as like somebody who may have some inside information, but we're all in the same mission.
Okay.
That's a good leader to me.
Okay. All right. Somebody else. Yes, sir. Okay.
About the leadership that
Okay.
they should be involved in, of caring for the sheep, and as already mentioned, first being an example of the sheep, concerned about their spiritual welfare.
Okay, the idea of shepherd. Now, we talk about shepherd quite a bit. We'll say our shepherds or shepherd, but I wonder if we can wrap our minds around this particular word as well, because I am not a shepherd. I don't know any shepherds. I think I've seen sheep about 3 times in my life. So what does the connotation, or what does the word shepherd suggest about leadership within the church? Yeah.
Wait.
Run, Vern, run. Put that new hip to work. Okay. It only works if it's on.
Caretaker for
Okay.
the people who have appointed them.
Okay.
To just show them correctly how to go and be and do correction if needed.
Okay. All right. What else? What is the idea of shepherd? Because we use the term a lot, but what are we trying to convey by using that term? What does it suggest about leadership? Okay, guidance.
Right over here. Come on, Artie. Keep an eye on it.
I even smiled at him too. I think it goes back to when you were talking about the difference between a monarch and a democracy. I think, kings and queens, maybe in time of like battle, would say, oh, we're going to have food rations because they want to make it through the winter. It's like they have like that information and they want to You have to just kind of like trust that they know what's going on. So when you talk about a shepherd, I kind of think the same thing. It's correction when it needs to happen. It's guiding with a gentle hand.
Okay, so guiding, I heard guidance a couple of times, direction. What else? Yes, ma'am? We want to make sure you get your steps in, Ernie.
Well, it hasn't been mentioned, and I'm not sure how it goes along with being a shepherd, but they are in charge of, let's say, classes and like Vacation Bible School, different things that we do in the church or do not do. Maybe that's like a shepherd in that the shepherd provides things for the
Okay,
sheep.
the idea of provision. All right.
Couldn't you also look at it as parenting in many
Okay.
ways?
The idea of
Right.
parenting. Well,
You know, you teach, you teach your children, you guide your children, you want to show them the correct way, and do right from wrong and whatnot. So I think there's an aspect of parenting behind that too.
okay. I like that idea. I heard you say not your words, mine. I heard you say the idea of not just simply providing, but also teaching how to. So it's that whole give a man a fish versus teaching man a fish kind of thing. That there is an element of providing that which is needed, but also an element of trying to teach. So it's not just being spoon-fed all the time.
Like you said, I don't know anything about a shepherd. I've never, I go to the fair and I see sheep, so I've never seen shepherding in action, except for through the Bible. And in the Bible, it shows that the shepherd takes care of the flock. When he brings them in, he'll sit at the entrance so that nothing can get in to hurt them and they can't just wander off. But when one is gone, he will leave the entire flock to search out for that one.
Because we do get imagery throughout Scripture. In my mind, perhaps the best imagery comes from Psalm 23. It's the one you all probably heard at some point in time. The Lord is my shepherd. Now, it's trying to describe God as shepherd and David's experience with God as shepherd. But it also presents a picture because David's pulling on his idea and on his experience as a shepherd of what that looks like. He leads me beside still water, restores my soul, prepares a table before me. All of these things that this shepherd does as he leads David through all these different challenges, providing along the way. Now, it might interest you to know that throughout ancient culture, there were different types of shepherds. You kind of had chief shepherd and you had subsequent shepherds. Because today, for those of you who are aware of construction things, if you were hired to do a job as a construction guy, what is the first thing you're going to do? You're going to get subcontractors. That's the first thing you're going to do. Why? Because you're not going to try and do all those things. You're going to hire somebody else who's more specialized in this arena, and so you're going to get subcontractors. But who do they work for? They work for the main contractor, right? Same thing happened in ancient times, where you would have a chief shepherd or someone who owned the sheep who would then hire shepherds and bring those shepherds in order to take care of the sheep. But whose job was it to take care of the sheep? Well, the shepherd. But how was he supposed to take care of the sheep? In accordance with who hired him, what he would want, right? Well, Jesus is defined as the good shepherd, the primary shepherd. We might even say the chief shepherd, if you will. And then he brings in other shepherds to help shepherd and guide his sheep. But it suggests that they are, in fact, to lead, but not merely as they would want to, but to be guiding in a direction that Christ, who is the head, who is the good shepherd, would want everything to be guided towards.
Talk about a good shepherd, how do you analyze that? How do you know he's a good shepherd? Well, you notice that when the sheep trust him and follow him and rely on him for their food, their substance, and everything else. So it's a two-way thing. There's a respect of the sheep and there's a respect of the shepherd.
I want to switch imagery just a little bit. If today all of us became soldiers and we went out onto the front lines and we needed to find our superior commander, where would we go? Where would the office be? Okay, usually it's in the tent in the back, right? Now, I realize there's strategic reasons for that, but follow me. It's not a perfect analogy. It's in the back, right? And that's oftentimes how leadership can sometimes be pictured, but there are different types of leadership. Within the Bible, we see the idea of servant leadership, which suggests not merely something that takes place in the back, but that's something that takes place on the front line. I think you were talking about the idea of example of how then we are to live. That shepherds, eldership is not simply supposed to make decisions in a back room somewhere, but are to be portraying what it means so that we might follow them just as a sheep follows its shepherd. Because the shepherd isn't driving from the back. One of my favorite Parks illustrations, I don't remember all of them, but one of my favorites has to do with a shepherd versus a butcher. The story is told that out in Israel, a tourist group was coming by and were describing the idea of shepherd, and they saw a group of sheep and coming over the rise and said, oh, this must be a perfect idea of a shepherd. And then it was talked about how a shepherd never drives the sheep, but rather leads the sheep in a direction. And about that time, a man came over the hill with his hand above his head, driving these sheep somewhere. Well, of course, it ruined the young guide's illustration of what was supposed to be taking place. And so he went out and told this man, kind of ruined my illustration there. I was talking about how the shepherd always leads the sheep. He said, I'm not a shepherd, I'm a butcher. The butcher is the one who drives the sheep from the back as opposed to leading the sheep forward. So the idea of shepherd becomes rich in imagery of it's not just simply decision making. It does include decision making, don't get me wrong. For the shepherd had to decide for his sheep where to go that day and what was the best path to take in this particular instance and how were we supposed to survive the night when the wolves came howling. There were decisions to be made. But it was also a leading process and a caring process for sheep. When the sheep breaks its leg, guess who takes care of it? The shepherd. Guess how? He carries it. So it's both. It's decision making, but not purely decision making. It's relational, as that one says, relational rather than positional. Okay, we're back here and then up here.
Coming back to Christ, he's a king and a shepherd and a priest. So he's everything.
That's true.
He's the shepherd of us, and he's also high priest.
That's true.
So he's everything.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
I think one of the things that I've seen we need to be cautious about in our particular culture is we don't think of elders or shepherds in a business model, a U.S. business model of a corporation, something of that nature. In fact, I've heard comments along the line, well, he'd make a good elder because he's very successful in his business.
That's true. There's a reason why the Bible doesn't just describe the qualities of eldership as he makes a lot of money. But describes a variety of attributes, including the ability to lead, including the ability to teach, including the ability to be, what's the word I'm looking for? It starts with an H, not honest. Hospitable, including hospitality. All of those things. It's not just the one. Yes, sir.
In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 3, he gives a good explanation of what you were talking about with shepherds and chief shepherds, and the difference between a shepherd and a CEO. He says, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock, and when the chief shepherd appears. So it is important that shepherds remember their primary responsibility is to follow the chief shepherd in leading and protecting the flock.
Which brings us back to that whole idea of monarchy versus democracy. Of not only as an individual, for us as individuals, us as members, to recognize the importance of remembering Christ as head, but also for elders. That elders aren't to lead because, from the standpoint of, they are the board of directors who gets to make the decisions because they have all the power. No. That they too are to lead recognizing that this is a monarchy and they are entrusted emissaries of that monarchy. One of the aspects of eldership that I don't know that we talk about enough is the idea of defending the flock. We talk about making decisions. We talk about the idea of determining direction, things on those lines. But one of the ones that seems to be emphasized the most about shepherds is defending the flock. That's why Jesus will talk about that the good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. Good shepherds would make sure that the flock is in fact protected. And one of the primary reasons for the need of a shepherd in ancient times was to prevent predators from taking those sheep. So what things might an eldership or elders need to defend us from, you think? A brief list, because we're going to move on very soon. What do you think? Yeah?
Erroneous teaching.
Okay, there would be a need to correct teaching. All right, what else? Take it? Okay, dispute, that there's sometimes a need to maintain unity and try and work out disputes. Okay, what else?
Sheep's and wolves' clothing.
Okay, sheep's and wolves' clothing. All right. I know. I followed. It's wolves and sheep's clothing, but
Yeah.
But sometimes it's actually the other. But anyway. Now, let me ask you this. Where do you think the primary dangers to be defended for, how do I phrase this? Where do you think that the primary dangers from which we are to be defended originated from? There we go. I got it out. What do you think? Where do you think the primary dangers we need to be defended from, where do you think they originated from? Yeah, I knew somebody was going to go there. That's true. Where am I trying to ask? Okay, outside versus inside is kind of what I'm going for. Where do you, there would be both. But where do you think the primary danger ends up being? Huh? Second? Okay, ourselves, which would be from within as opposed to from without, right? Most of the time, whenever there's a description of elders or shepherds and the idea of defending, it's watch out for those who will be teaching. Well, we're not going to let just anybody in and teach, so that suggests that it would arise from within. More explicitly in Acts chapter 20, which is one of the texts in your list of texts there below, in Acts chapter 20, Paul is going to talk in terms of watch out for those ravenous wolves who will come in. And specifically says from within yourselves, which can actually mean two things. One, from within yourselves in terms of the congregation, but two, from within the eldership itself. One of the questions that oftentimes emerges is, well, who corrects elders? Well, elders are supposed to correct elders. And one of the challenges that we sometimes run into within a church as a whole in Christendom is it is much easier to correct those who are outside than it is to correct those with whom I'm right around, which suggests in terms of how do we identify elders. It's not just CEOs who can make decisions and who can give orders. Rather, it is those who are willing to even stand up to one another when it's hard. Because one of the primary responsibilities is to defend the flock from those who might destroy it, either intentionally or unintentionally. Because there are plenty who would never intend to do any harm. But sometimes, even in our best intentions, sometimes we can do things we didn't realize we were doing. And if you've ever tried to go up to somebody and correct them, you know it's hard. Maybe if not for some. Some of us really appreciate the idea for battle. But for some of us, it can be hard, especially with somebody you care about. But it has to be individuals who are still willing to move through that discomfort for the sake of the flock. Yes, sir.
Churches will try to treat error, and particularly what is called denominational error, is that they become obsessed with this, and then it becomes polarizing, and there becomes an arrogance within trying to fight against what is called error, and it within itself becomes destructive, I think.
The way in which we handle conflict or disagreement, or even times whenever correction needs to occur, can itself create more challenges if not handled well. I want us to, let's see, how does this next thing go? Yes. Other leaders would include deacons. Now, they're not the same as that of elders. They don't have the same level of authority. But there is an element of leadership, if nothing else from the standpoint of example. In my mind, there are two different types of leaders. Follow my thinking. Have you ever noticed how some people, they have no leadership role whatsoever, and yet people listen to them? Have you ever noticed that? You've probably seen somebody at your company who everybody listens to. You've probably seen somebody within your family who just sits there, and yet nobody's going to move until that person speaks. Those people are leaders. They just are different types of leaders. There are also individuals who have a leadership role with the responsibilities associated with that leadership role who are tasked with that particular leadership role. Do you see my differentiation? I'm looking for this or okay. The reason why that differentiation is important is deacons do not have the authority that elders do. Yet there is a sense in which as we watch how they serve that we too are influenced to be able to serve more. But don't mishear me and somehow think that they're somehow the same. They're not. Deacons are servants, yet there's an element of leadership in the example that they choose to set. There are ministers, we sometimes refer to them as preachers. This is page 30. And there's an element of leadership, not because I have any kind of power or leadership given to me, but because you listen to my voice to some extent. There's an element of leadership within that process as we devote or as we explore the word together, which means that there's a responsibility on my part and how I choose to prepare and how I choose to communicate, because with every minister there is some aspect of leadership in what they choose to say. Okay. These are your next bullet points. The primary purpose of evangelists or preachers is to preach the good news. We're going to shift to members of the church. These are your last blanks on page 30. One of the primary responsibilities for us as members of a congregation, is the idea of choosing to be an example to one another, as well as choosing to follow the leadership of those who God has instilled to be able to lead. When you hear the word submission, what comes to mind? What do you think? What does submission mean? Yep. Okay, allowing yourself to be persuaded by someone who talks, okay? Okay. What does submission mean, you think? Yep.
You can give up your will to do what you want in respect of what the leader
To give up
wants.
your will for doing what you want, okay? What does submission mean? I'm curious, how many of you have ever watched WWE? How about UFC?
Tap out.
To tap out. Now, if we're honest, that's what we hear. Subjugation as opposed to submission. Because there's this wonderful thing called a submission hold. It's great when you perform it on somebody. It really is not all that much fun when it's done on you. But that's really, I think, what we hear within our culture, if we're honest. Even though we might know the different definitions, what we kind of hear is the idea that we are being subjugated. And we live in a culture where we tend to rebel. It's just what we do. That's how our nation was born. But that means that subjugation feels really funny to us. It feels really awkward to us. And we kind of hear the idea of subjugation when it's not the case. Or someone will misuse the idea of submission, of it's your job to submit to me. In the moment somebody does that, submission is not possible anymore. For all of us practice submission at one point or another, especially when you're driving. When you're driving along, you see that upside down triangle painted in red. What does it mean? It means to yield. How many of you know what it means to yield? That's about what I thought, based on my driving in Arizona. That yielding, at least the red one, the yellow one you don't have to, but the red one, you're supposed to stop and wait for the other person, right? Not how fast can I get there before they get there. We're supposed to stop and wait for the other person. That is the idea of submission. The idea of giving up my will is partly true in that I choose to not insist on my own will. That doesn't mean that I have to be a doormat and that I can't have opinions. It doesn't mean that I have to be a doormat and can't have a will or a desire. It just means that, okay, I'm going to honor yours instead of my own. And submission appears all throughout the Bible, depending upon, and in different arenas of application. For we're to submit one to another, not necessarily the same way we would submit to eldership, but submit one to another. Why? Because, well, if I'm supposed to put your needs before my own, then that would mean there's going to be an element of submission, especially when we disagree. For how are we to be a unified body in the midst of disagreement? And there will be disagreement. Otherwise, we're not actually unified. That's just called agreement. And the people who agree tend to hang out together and agree with one another, and then there's unity, which really isn't unity, it's just agreement, because we all happen to agree. True unity is when we can disagree and still love one another and care about one another and want to take care of one another. And that's a lot harder. And the only way that we arrive at such a place is through the practice of submission. Of, well, Christ is the head, this is what he said he wanted, so therefore we'll do that. Or, well, I care about you and I care and I love you, so therefore I'm going to choose to do what you mattered more to you than to me, even though I disagree with you and even though I can hold on to my own will, but just because of my desire to show my care for you. So submission applies in that realm. It applies in the family realm, but it also applies within following the elders realm. That if we're to follow our shepherd, there's an element of submission. For he who chooses to follow submits himself to following to the one he's leading. Follow me? You understand what I'm saying? We can't follow somebody unless there's an element of submission. I say I'm going to choose to go where that person's going. Is there an element of trust? Absolutely. That's why we better be careful who are our elders. Because there's an element of trust. But it also means whenever a decision is made that we're not really sure we agree with, is it okay to go up and ask the elders or talk to the elders and communicate to them? I'm not so sure about this. Absolutely, because good shepherds listen. But at the end of the day, it might be, well, this is what we believe is the best decision because of. And then as a member, my responsibility is to say, okay, well, I trust you. I don't necessarily agree with you, but I trust you. Yes?
Yeah, you just said what I was going to say. That
Sorry,
using the no, that's okay. Using the the traffic sign analogy, caution. We should use caution. We should submit cautiously.
Okay? Submit cautiously. All right? I see what you're saying. Is it possible that somebody, our submission is first and foremost to God and to Christ, right? So if we are being asked to do something that is completely contrary to what Christ said, are we supposed to continue to submit? Of course not. Anything other than that, we are. Anything that doesn't explicitly contradict what Christ has told us to do, then we're supposed to trust our shepherds and follow them. Even when we disagree. Doesn't mean that we have to just sit there and not ever say anything. Don't do that. But that we're still supposed to choose to follow. What do you think? Yes.
In the past, I've been part of congregations where elders abused their power and did not feel like they had to explain anything or give reasons, and you were not to question. So I feel like it's a two-way street. Is they have to be very careful with how they approach members and kind and explain things. They're not just the judge that you don't ever get to say, I don't understand. You know, it was not a great feeling when you had questions and you weren't allowed to voice them.
Absolutely. You're right that there is supposed to be, it is a two-way street. That's why the elders are supposed to lead not as CEOs in a boardroom, but rather as shepherds who've shown the love and care and concern and who listen. But at the same time, we bear responsibility in terms of our interaction with them, that it is this two-way street. It's not meant to be merely lording over. That's why the text says, do not lord it over, but rather be servant leaders. And there is a difference between the two. Anything else? Once, twice. Yeah. He's coming.
I would just say, I think it was Don who mentioned, like corporate America, right? In me being, in corporate America, I see bosses and I see leaders, right? And bosses are judge, jury, and executioners, right? And then leaders promote collaboration and involvement, and they're involved throughout that process. And that's the big difference I see, between, those two things.
That's a good distinction, that elders are not called to be bosses, but called to be leaders. That's a good distinction. Anything else? Yeah?
I been holding out on this one.
Uh-oh.
I read a book years ago was called The Peter Principle.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody's ever read that before or not.
I see at least one head nod.
Okay. Well, what happens is someone is a good employee and they work hard and they accomplish their tasks and everything else. And someone up above him says, I think we need to make him a supervisor. Well, he's not a supervisor. He's a good worker. And sometimes we look at the eldership the same way. As he's a good person, he does this, he does that, and everything else. He'd make a good elder. Well, he doesn't have the ability to decipher different situations. All he knows is he's a good worker. And sometimes we got to be careful with that because we put people in that position, and it's a very important position. It's not just like a corporate decision. You're dealing with God. And when you put them in that position, they need to be able to feel the room, know the room, and help the room. And that's just something that I've experienced
Yeah.
in my work.
Go ahead.
I saw a real example that at one point back when I was preaching in Ohio, I had a friend who preached in a congregation where they had this member that everybody in the county knew him well. And he could do just about anything. He could fill in the pulpit. He was enthusiastic as a song leader and would serve in so many different capacities. Well, then they made him an elder. And he became Attila the Hun. And it got so bad that finally the congregation called an emergency meeting with the eldership and laid out what was going on. And he cried and he apologized and he repented and said he was sorry he had learned his lesson. And so they left him in as an elder. And 6 months later, they had another meeting, and they said this time, they said to him, we don't want you to resign as an elder. We want you to leave the congregation. And here was an example of that Peter principle, that he was the ideal model Christian until he reached the eldership. And the problem with the Peter principle is that normally, according to the Peter principle, once a person reaches his first magnitude of incompetency, he stays there instead of going back to what he could do well. And we all need to be humble enough to say, what abilities has the Lord given me, and what do I do well for the kingdom?
That's good. When we read in Timothy and Titus, we encounter what we oftentimes call qualifications associated with eldership. When I hear qualifications, I hear resume. Do you hear that too? Because normally when we're talking about some kind of job, here are the qualifications associated with this. You need to be able to do this, you need to be able to do this, and you need to be able to do this. There's another way to view qualifications, and that is what's called a character sketch. My suspicion is that it's somewhere in between the two. A character sketch is not so much this is exactly the case, as much as this is generally speaking the kind of individual we were looking for. Do you see the difference between the two? One is saying, so long as you can do these things, it's fine. The other one is saying, here's the type of individual we want, and I suspect it's both of them. For the individual qualifications that are given, we're given for a reason, but just because you can do this, this, and this, does not mean that this is the spot that is best for you. We have to be careful who becomes elders, because if we're supposed to submit to them, one of the questions we have to ask is, can I submit to that individual? Because I'm supposed to. And if I can't, then that means either there's something inherently wrong with me, or it might mean we need to have a conversation. But we don't want to go so far either that we suggest that, well, we need the perfect individual to be an elder, because then we will have no elders. It doesn't have to be the perfect individual, but it does need to be someone for whom it appears that God has been preparing and growing them for this particular reason. And how would we know? How would we know whether God has grown an individual and we think this would be a good leader? Not because he's a successful individual, not because we see him look a certain way or act a certain way, but because we believe him to be at his core what God has grown to be an elder. How would we know? What do you think? kind of got to spend time with one another, right? I'm currently reading a book called Quiet. I like it. Basically, the argument is that our love of extroversion as a result of the Industrial Revolution has changed the way that we see the world. So much so that we talk most about first impressions. That's why you coach yourself or have gone through training for a job interview, is so you can make a good first impression, because what matters most is first impressions. And we've sacrificed the knowledge of character for first impressions as a result. And we can do that within the church as well. We just need to find somebody, or at least it would be easy to just find somebody who our first impression of them is that they would be a good elder. We don't actually know their character, who they are at a deeper level, to know whether this is what God has prepared them for, or this is just what we think. And the only way, well, that's not entirely fair. I guess there are two ways. One is a whole lot of prayer, and we need to be doing a whole lot of prayer. But the other is we really need to get to know one another, otherwise we're not going to know. Which means we have to spend time with one another outside of just this setting. We have to engage with one another in order to be able to understand how a person has grown, or perhaps see, yeah, maybe this isn't the best spot. Or maybe this person really would be. Or maybe this person who we didn't initially think would be one, turns out their character is great and they're somebody who would be. But the only way we would know is if we truly get to know one another well. Any comments before I try and wrap up this lesson? All right. Oh, goodness. I could do this in 3 minutes. Here are your bullet points associated with number 31, or page number 31. It has to do with the biblical nature of worship. We come to understand what worship is really through two ways. One is command, and the other is what you may have heard described as the pattern. What I mean whenever I say pattern is the pattern associated with how the New Testament did what they did. And the thought process is as well, if the New Testament did this, if the first century church, those closest to Christ, lived this way, worshiped in this way, then odds are this is how we too are supposed to worship. And so you have both of them. Sometimes explicit commands, sometimes just the pattern of how we might very well do something. And we usually see all these within the pattern. Lord's Supper, you know what that is. The idea of prayers, the idea of giving, the idea of reading and preaching and singing are all things that we see the first century church do, all things that we see presented as things that we ought to do as well as we try and come together and worship and grow together as well. All right, I think I did that in 2 minutes. Any last comments before we wrap up? Yes.
As a checklist.
You're right.
Then it becomes very legalistic. I think we look at each one of these and we begin to understand, discern why this becomes a part of our worship and our fellowship.
That's fair. Remember last week we talked about what is the church? And we talked about how the church is the temple of Christ, or the temple of the Holy Spirit, that we're told that God is growing us together to be his temple. And all of these would be an aspect of it. What I find interesting is that each one of these aspects usually is most important to somebody else. So if singing is not your most important thing, it just doesn't move you, chances are it does somebody else. And as we do all things, they all grow us together. They all grow us to be more like Christ. They're all part of what we're supposed to do. But it shouldn't be just this checklist of, oh, yep, we did this, we did this, we did this. That we've been asked to do these things for a reason, not just simply to say, oh, yep, okay, we did that, we did that, we did that. All right, let's pray together. We'll be done. Dear Father, Lord, we're so thankful for your church. So thankful that you have brought us to you, that you are growing us to look more like you. We ask you help us to seek you in all we do. Lord, we love you and can't wait to be with you in Christ's name.